What do you think of when you think of Thanksgiving? Turkey, pumpkins, family and friends, and maybe some football? But does Thanksgiving ever remind you to thank God for the Constitution and our freedom? For many of us, this probably isn't something we consciously think about. But I don't think it's because of ingratitude, but maybe because we have been conditioned to view Thanksgiving as the last hurdle to Christmas. As Americans, and especially as Latter day Saints, we ought to review the way we celebrate Thanksgiving and get back to celebrating it the way it was intended to be celebrated. So, let's explore a little of the history of Thanksgiving. In November of 1621, the Pilgrims' first corn harvest in their new land was a success. As a celebration, William Bradford gathered his people together along with members of the Wampanoag tribe, including Chief Massasoit, in a festival that lasted 3 days. This is now referred to as America's first Thanksgiving. But did you know this was not the first Thanksgiving in the United States? The first Thanksgiving celebrated in our country took place under George Washington and looked very different than the Thanksgiving we celebrate today. But before we get into that, I want to set the stage and dig into the character of George Washington and his relationship with his maker so that we can understand what makes Thanksgiving so special. George Washington is America's most indispensable man. Most Americans, I presume, have a very favorable view of him. Many of us also believe him to have been a man of high moral character. What may not be so obvious to some, however, is Washington's deep trust and reliance on God. For example, during the French and Indian War, the young Washington was traveling with nearly 1,500 soldiers to a nearby fort held by the French. On their way, they were ambushed by French and Indian forces, and it was a massacre. Nearly all of the officers were killed, and over 900 British soldiers lay dead. Washington, however, escaped without a scratch, having had 2 horses shot from under him and bullet holes through his coat and his hat. Later, the native chief who oversaw the combat remarked, "Our rifles were leveled, rifles which but for him knew not how to miss. 'Twas all in vain. A power mightier far than we shielded him from harm. He cannot die in battle. The Great Spirit protects that man and guides his destinies. He will become the chief of nations, and a people yet unborn will hail him as the founder of a mighty empire." Of this experience, Washington would remark that it was only by the miraculous care of Providence that protected me beyond all human expectation. This was the first time that divine providence would protect young Washington, but it surely was not the last. During the Revolutionary War, Washington experienced a number of situations in which the interposition of God was manifest. One such experience came in 1776. The British had secretly arranged for Sergeant Thomas Hickey, one of Washington's personal bodyguards, to assassinate the general. When his treachery was discovered, he was court-martialed, tried, and hanged. Of this and many other experiences throughout the war, Washington would write to a friend, "No man has a more perfect reliance on the all-wise and powerful dispensations of the Supreme Being than I have, nor thinks his aid more necessary." Washington knew that God's help was so necessary in the battle for freedom and independence that he ordered the appointment of a chaplain in each regiment to encourage every officer and man so to live and act as becomes a Christian soldier, because the blessings and protection of heaven are at all times necessary. And the general was no hypocrite. He practiced what he preached. Multiple accounts detail having seen Washington on his knees praying for divine aid. By the time the Revolution was over, the Constitution was written, and Washington was elected as president, he exclaimed in his first inaugural address, "There is no truth more thoroughly established than that there exists an indissoluble union between virtue and happiness. The propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained." Our first American leader lived his whole life relying on and trusting in God. So what does any of this have to do with Thanksgiving? Like I said, this background is key to understanding the Thanksgiving Proclamation that Washington issued in 1789. So just what did this document say? Well, in it, Washington proclaimed that it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly to implore His protection and favor. He then asked the people to set aside the last Thursday of November to be a day of thanksgiving and prayer, to unite in giving God sincere and humble thanks for His care and protection, for His favorable interposition during the war, for the great degree of tranquility, union, and plenty enjoyed by the people, for the peaceable and rational manner in which the Constitution was established, and for the civil and religious liberty with which we are blessed. Washington then went on to implore Americans to offer their prayers for the Lord to pardon our national and other transgressions, and to allow the people to perform their duties properly so that the government can remain a government of wise, just, and constitutional laws. Each of us would do well to read this document and remember that these words are the foundation of our national thanksgiving. These words and admonitions were pertinent then and remain so now. But why is this especially important for Latter-day Saints? In October of 2019, acting president of the Quorum of the 12, M. Russell Ballard, stated that America is at another crossroad, and that we must stand boldly for righteousness and truth, and must defend the cause of honor, decency, and personal freedom espoused by Washington, Madison, Adams, Lincoln, and other leaders who acknowledged and loved God. And here's what it comes down to. He further went on to admonish the saints. Our nation was founded on prayer. It was preserved by prayer, and we need prayer again. The first Thanksgiving in the United States was all about giving thanks to God and asking for His continued protection and guidance. America needs our fervent prayers at this crossroads President Ballard mentioned. I believe that if we were to pray this Thanksgiving as Washington admonished and live righteous lives, we would see miracles in this land. America needs hope, healing, and forgiveness that can only come through the aid of divine providence. If we fail to implore for heaven's help and live righteous lives, we will fail as a nation. The prophet Joseph Smith said that one day the Constitution would hang by a thread, and that the elders of Israel would save it from destruction. But how can we save it and preserve our liberties if we carelessly sit back and wait for the church to tell us what to do? If we humble ourselves before God, He will show us what to do in each of our individual capacities. My invitation to you this Thanksgiving is to read Washington's Thanksgiving Proclamation and follow his prescriptions. Use this time of Thanksgiving to thank God for the blessings and liberties we have enjoyed in this great country. Ask God to help us perform our duties properly. Ask for forgiveness of our individual and national sins. And ask for protection and inspiration as we seek to preserve our God-given freedoms. Please help this message to get out to as many people as possible before Thanksgiving. Like, share, comment. Let us all turn our hearts to God and help others do the same.